The story of Red Dead Redemption 2 shows the decline of the Van der Linde gang. From the perspective of Arthur Morgan, we see this tight-knit group of people simply fall apart through hubris and recklessness from its leadership and betrayal. The demise of the Van der Linde gang is aided along by a rat, seemingly with their own agenda. And at the end of Chapter 6, we discover that this traitor was Micah Bell. However, it seems as if he only turned traitor in the final chapters of the game. However, from the very beginning of the main story, the gang appears to be dogged by misfortune that seemingly rears its ugly head far too often to be just bad luck. In today's video, we're going to be exploring the prospect that there may have been another traitor within the Van der Linde gang. This video was suggested by Fizhy Gaming, a channel I highly recommend if you enjoy Red Dead content as much as I do, who has explored this idea in a video himself. I will link it in the description. Now, do I believe there could have been a second traitor within the Van der Linde gang? Well, I certainly believe it is possible, but not necessarily 100% likely. But that won't exclude me from enjoying a good theory or two today. For example, I quite enjoy hearing about the Darth Jar Jar theory from Star Wars. However, we can all agree it's fucking ludicrous. This is arguably far more tame territory, don't get me wrong, but any theories I put forward today will be explored from the angle where it works and the angle where it doesn't. But before we get into any of that, let's establish the context. As the story progresses into the later chapters, the concept of there being a rat, a traitor within the gang, begins to circulate ever so slightly.
You know, when I look back at all the chaos of the past few weeks, the apparent superficial chaos, I begin to wonder, maybe, for somebody, this is all going exactly to plan.
Dutch floats the idea of there possibly being a traitor in the midst of the gang as early as the Guarma chapter. Whilst that's quite late, it's fair to say there's a good chance he's not necessarily wrong. This seemingly gets vindicated in a surprise confession from Molly O'Shea, and then later Agent Andrew Milton, who claims Molly said nothing but Micah has been informing since he returned from Guarma.
Micah? You mean Molly?
Molly O'Shea? Sweated her a couple of times, never talked a word, had to let her go. Micah Bell. We picked him up when you boys came back from the Caribbean, and he's been a good boy ever since.
Okay.
Seeing Arthur's condition and liking his chances, it's entirely likely that Agent Milton is in a sharing mood and is being 100% honest here. But even with a dying man at the end of your barrel, it makes no sense to lay all your cards on the table. Milton is far from an honourable man, and he's certainly not above lying, but he is intelligent. Well, he was. On the off chance things don't go his way in the immediate moment, why not sow further chaos and not give every single detail? With that in mind, with the information he provides us at the end of Red Dead Redemption 2 effectively, Micah's activities as a traitor doesn't necessarily track as far back as the gang's pattern of misfortune and the theory of some inside party sowing this chaos. And so that's effectively the baseline for the fan idea that there's another traitor has come from. But from that conversation we learn that Micah Bell is a traitor, and Molly O'Shea, despite confessing to having told the Pinkertons information, actually said nothing and got herself killed over nothing. But as a result of saying nothing, the Pinkertons had to let her go. This doesn't necessarily make sense, but we'll come back to all of this later. But for the time being, let's head all the way back to the beginning of the main story, where we join the gang as they travel through the mountains after the failed, infamous ferry heist in Blackwater. This moment is pivotal in the beginning of the end for the gang. Details about it are both scarce and abundant at the same time. Arthur was not involved in the ferry heist itself and only really saw the aftermath, as he and Hosea Matthews were busy with a different scheme. For the time being, the only relevant information about the ferry heist was that there was a lot of money on that boat and the robbery was going well until it suddenly wasn't. One of the first things we can optionally ask Dutch is whether he thinks it was a trap or not.
So, do you think it was a trap in Blackwater?
That many men? Oh, they knew we were coming. But there was money on that boat, all right. Lots of it. I stashed what we took with all our money in town right before we fled.
At this point in the story, Dutch is portrayed as a trustworthy leader, an ally. What he says at this point in the narrative holds weight. If this version of Dutch believed something to be a trap, it almost certainly was. So the authorities, at the very least, had information that there was going to be a ferry robbery in Blackwater, and rather than guard the score jealously, they established a trap and waited for the gang to fall into it. This is later corroborated by Javier.
So, you were there, Javier. What really happened on that boat?
We had the money, it seemed fine. And suddenly they were everywhere.
Bounty hunters?
No, Pinkertons. It was crazy. Raining bullets.
The Pinkertons knew the gang would go for the ferry, even though one of the key themes of the game is that Dutch doesn't lay anywhere near as low as he thinks he does. It's quite clear that knowing of such a heist would require some degree of inside intelligence, or at the very least some degree of knowledge that something was going to go down. But being prepared and springing a trap on the Van der Linde gang to me suggests that perhaps somebody knew something and told somebody something. Whether or not that individual was a part of the Van der Linde gang is unclear. If the gang had made tons of noise prior to the Blackwater robbery, it could very much have been a case of the gang not being as subtle as they believe they are. And according to Arthur's journal, there was, as he puts it, business up north and a fire, but he doesn't necessarily go into too much detail, leading me to believe that it's been quite peaceful and quiet ever since, with the gang spending winter in the western foothills of the mountains, where food was easy to find and life was good. But an interesting detail is who put Dutch onto the idea of robbing the ferry. None other than Micah Bell himself. Micah convincing Dutch to take on the ferry job is confirmed in camp conversations as well.
What went on in Blackwater?
We got jumped. What do you think happened?
You said it was going to be easy.
I did the best I could, old man. I don't answer to you.
We're running for our lives because of a bad call you made.
We're bank robbers. Way I see it, it's an occupational hazard.
So the first question brings us to our first suspect. Was Micah Bell a traitor from the very beginning? Let's investigate that. Micah is a hothead who simply loves killing, loves robbing. He's a cruel and almost sadistic individual who everybody in the Van der Linde gang, barring Dutch, notices to be out of place. Nobody seems to like him, and he doesn't really care. When instructed to lie low, he got arrested for murder in Strawberry, and then upon being broken out, per Dutch's request, he massacred the entire town, and says Arthur's first and last name an uncomfortable amount of times in the process, so any potential survivors, not that that's a given, it was a pretty thorough killing, will know that Arthur Morgan, the notorious Van der Linde gang enforcer, was involved in this massacre.
Come on, Arthur! I got some unfinished business! Trust me, Morgan! We're in it now, Morgan! What do you want to do?
So he makes a ton of noise when the absolute opposite is what's required. And then, upon escaping, instead of returning to camp, he goes off to his campsite near the town. You could argue he's splitting off from Arthur to see if the law follows Arthur instead of him. And if Arthur comes to his camp at a later date, it proves to Micah that that didn't happen. If you return to the remnants of this camp after doing the mission here, you'll discover some pretty interesting things. One's a newspaper scrap listing Micah and his father as potential suspects in a robbery/murder. But the other thing is a $1,000 reward, dead or alive wanted poster for Dutch Van der Linde. He could have been removing this wanted poster from wherever it was, in an attempt to take the heat off of Dutch, but it would be pissing in the wind. There would be hundreds of these bad boys. But I also don't think it necessarily means that Micah is planning on turning Dutch in either. My logic is, even Arthur keeps memorabilia of his notoriety. It would make sense that Micah does a similar thing. Having a wanted poster for Dutch is an interesting one though, but I don't think it outright means that Micah is planning on flipping on the gang. According to Milton, Micah only becomes an informant for the Pinkertons after the Guarma chapter, which is an awful lot later in the game, but in fairness, Milton is far from portrayed as an honourable and trustworthy individual himself. Whilst in that moment it seemed he had no reason to lie, we can't exclude it. But for the sake of the narrative's integrity, I do believe Agent Milton is at least telling the majority of the truth. Micah was not functioning as a Pinkerton asset until that moment. However, come the very end of the story, when Micah is confronted about this revelation, he never confirms it, not really. He simply claims that he's waited a long time to kill Arthur and that he's a survivor.
I'm a survivor, Black Lung! A survivor! That's all there is! Living and dying! Oh, Black Lung, you don't know how much I've longed to do this!
There's no confirmation on if what Milton said is entirely true, but it doesn't matter. Micah has revealed that he was never loyal to the gang, so by that logic, he was never a traitor, because you cannot betray something you were never truly loyal to. I believe Micah joined the gang with the intent of using them in order to acquire the Blackwater money for himself. If all the heat was on Dutch, it was not on him. If you think about it, he's constantly mentioning the Blackwater money, so Micah's loyalties start to finish are to himself. He was only a rat for the Pinkertons after chapter 5, but before then, his actions were serving his self-interest and not the gang's. So if doing the gang dirty was in his best interests, he would do that without hesitation, by whatever means necessary. So with the obvious being Micah being a bad egg from go out of the way, now we can look at our second suspect, the other individual that Milton mentions, Molly O'Shea. The idea that the Pinkertons simply had to let her go because she was not talking simply does not make sense. Especially when a heartbroken Molly O'Shea confessed to telling Milton and Ross information about Dutch and that she'd do it again.
I told them!
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I told them and I tell them again. Now I've got God's ear.
You told who? What?
Mr. Milton and Mr. Ross about the bank robbery, and I wanted them to kill you.
You did what?
I loved you, you goddamn bastard! Go on, shoot me!
She ain't worth it. You told on me.
Oh, you're
You
not so
betrayed
big now,
me.
are you?
What? Calm down. Arthur, she's a fool. Get her out of here. You know the rules.
Oh, not so big now. Hurry, Your Majesty!
You...
Supposedly Molly knew the rules here, so perhaps a heartbroken Miss O'Shea used this as a means of suicide, so what she may or may not have said to the Pinkertons remains unconfirmed. But if we refer to a conversation as early back as chapter 3, it's quite clear that something is going on and Molly is hesitant to talk to anybody about it.
How is Dutch? I mean, how does he seem to you?
I'm about the same as usual, I guess.
I really love him, you know. But if he... Like he always says, loyalty is everything, so...
Arthur! Excuse me, Miss O'Shea.
What you want?
I bring a gift.
The conversation is very quickly interrupted, but it appears as if she was about to spill the beans on something. Molly's actual involvement with the gang is noticeably limited in its capacity. She doesn't involve herself in any of the main story missions outside of that cutscene and the time she was shot. Around camp, she believes she's above helping with chores and other activities that the gang members do in their downtime. Her interests seemingly begin and end entirely with Dutch himself, as she blatantly refuses for the most part to interact with anybody else, unless somehow the conversation finds its way back to Dutch. She's completely uninterested in helping, and thanks to a poem she wrote about her love for Dutch, it's also quite clear that she holds disdain for members of the Van der Linde gang, referring to them as parasites and lackeys. Without her love for Dutch tethering her to the gang, what's actually stopping her from talking, as their relationship seems to go sour quite quickly after they come down from the mountain. And by chapter 3, Dutch and Molly's bickering and arguing can be heard quite regularly. Also, Milton suggests that they attempted to exploit this perceived weakness in the gang more than once, but at the time where he claimed Molly actually didn't say anything to them, he's in quite the sharing mood, so maybe that's just the end of it. And the biggest part of Molly's story is her deteriorating mental state, and that's almost entirely due to Dutch losing interest in her, and it ultimately led her to confessing to doing something she hadn't done in order to be killed. So, with the obvious out of the way, what are the other possibilities? There are a handful of theories out there. For example, there's one that suggests Simon Pearson is the other rat, but yeah, nah. Another possibility is Josiah Trelawney. Trelawney is a member of the gang that is barely trusted. He's seldom a part of the camp and seemingly comes and goes. He's not exactly disloyal, as Arthur puts it, but he's not committed to the gang. We can even discover that he has a family in Saint Denis. But Arthur describes him as a cockroach in a fancy suit, and every time they consider cutting him loose, he comes back with something that proves his value to the gang once again. But even still, he's barely attached and has interests elsewhere that can be taken advantage of. He even gets captured and interrogated by bounty hunters in chapter 3. But it's his wording here that leads me to believe that he's not indeed a traitor, he's just a good scammer.
Put your feet up, why don't you?
You okay?
Never finer.
So, who was they?
They were bounty hunter. Attached to Cole Stoudemire.
Okay.
They weren't looking for me, per se.
What you tell them?
Not much. I told them I was an intellectual. Come down here from Oregon, looking for a job at the university. Of course, they didn't believe me. Seems you stirred up quite a hornet's nest in Blackwater.
So I keep hearing.
It might be best if I stay with you, gentlemen, for a while. Can't go back to that caravan now.
All right, Charles. You take Trelawney back to camp. I'll catch up with you.
I think it's fair to say that Trelawney actually has less reason than anybody else to flip on the gang. In the event that Pinkertons smite the Van der Linde gang, as long as he's not there, he's not involved. Being detached means he's technically not even a part of the gang. He can come and go as he pleases, but being involved means that he makes money. It's not a terrible theory, as he's not somebody you'd be trusting, but when you put it under a microscope, it very quickly loses its logic. There are theories that Charles Smith could be the traitor, but he's a very principled individual. His morals don't change and his character doesn't change, and he wouldn't be willing to walk that grey line between being a part of the gang and an informant for some government agency or otherwise. So in other words, we can dismiss that idea without wasting too much time and too many words on it. It's interesting that he doesn't seem to be swayed by Dutch's fancy words, unlike most of the other members of the gang, but he explains his loyalty quite early in the game.
Sure, I could fall in with another gang, but Dutch... You know, Dutch is different.
Oh, yes. Dutch is certainly different.
He treats me fair. Most of you do. And for a fella with a black father and an Indian mother, that ain't normally the case.
Now, Philby Gaming's theory as to who this prospective second traitor might have been is perhaps one of the better ones in the sea of many that are out there. His theory goes that the second rat is none other than Abigail Roberts. Abigail is the mother to Jack Marston. Her primary loyalty is to her son, and not the gang. Around camp, she can be heard expressing her concerns about raising Jack around the gang.
I'm frightened, Hosea. Real frightened.
Of what?
Pinkertons, bounty hunters. It all feels... We've been in bad situations before, but... I feel like my whole life's been one long, bad situation. I'm a mother. It's the truth, Arthur. Listen all you want, but it's the truth. I'm afraid. First time in my life.
I know, my dear.
What are we gonna do? Is Dutch... I mean, he's always found a way, but lately
I know, dear. Seems we don't have a choice but to ride this train to the end of the line. If I were you, think of the boy and make plans.
I just wish John was... I care about him. Damn fool that he is.
I know, dear. Stay calm. Jack needs you calm.
Abigail expresses her doubts in Dutch going forward, and confides in Hosea that she has worries. Hosea's simple advice is to think of Jack and make plans, because unlike the others, she and John have something to fight for that goes far beyond the gang ever will. Later in the chapter, Abigail will ask Arthur to do something with Jack because he seems quite down of late. It's peculiar that she would ask Arthur when usually it's Hosea that's picking up John's slack, but Arthur agrees and takes Jack fishing down by a river nearby. Conveniently, this is where Pinkerton agents Milton and Ross first approach Arthur and try to convince him to bring in Dutch.
Arthur, isn't it? Arthur Morgan?
Who are you?
Yes, Arthur Morgan, Vanderlyn's most trusted associate. You've read the files. Typical case. Orphaned street kid seduced by that maniac's silver tongue and matures into a degenerate murderer. Agent Milton, Agent Ross. Pinkerton Detective Agency, seconded to the United States government. Nice to finally meet. We know a lot about you.
Do you?
You're a wanted man, Mr. Morgan. There's $5,000 for your head alone.
$5,000? For me? Can I turn myself in?
We want Vanderlyn.
Oh, Dutch. I haven't seen him for months.
That's so. Because I heard a guy fitting his description robbed a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwall up near Granite Pass.
Oh, ain't that a little old-fashioned nowadays?
Apparently not. Listen. This is my offer, Mr. Morgan. Bring in Vanderlyn, and you have my word you won't swing.
Oh, I ain't gonna swing anyways, Agent
Milton.
You see, I haven't done anything wrong, aside from not playing the games to your rules.
Spare me the philosophy lesson. I've already heard it from Mac Callender.
Mac Callender?
He was pretty shot up by the time I got to him. So really, it was more of a mercy killing. Slow, but merciful.
You enjoy being a rich man's toy, dear.
I enjoy society, flaws and all. You people venerate savagery, and you will die. Savagely, all of you.
Oh, we're all gonna die, Agent.
Some of us sooner than others.
It's an interesting interaction. Surely they could just take Arthur here and now, and then Jack as well, and use him as a trap to bring in more members of the gang, as they clearly care about this child, or at least that's how it seems. However, maybe they're working a different angle, and maybe that child's well-being is the insurance policy. The theory goes that Abigail set up this meet knowing that in Jack's company Arthur would not respond violently to being approached by Pinkerton detectives. And then, upon returning to camp, though Arthur doesn't necessarily indicate that something is wrong, Abigail seemingly knows.
There you are!
How you boys getting on?
Great! We caught a fish, and I made you this necklace.
Ain't that pretty? Ain't I the luckiest? Did you thank Uncle Arthur?
No need. We had a good time.
What's wrong?
Nothing. Just met some folk. I better go speak with Dutch.
Okay.
Hey, you did real fine, kid.
The next thing comes when Jack has been abducted by the Braithwaite family at the very end of Chapter 3. Obviously now in a desperate headspace. It's interesting that this is also conveniently when the Pinkertons discover the exact location of the gang's camp. It's interesting timing, but the Pinkertons would definitely have had the resources available to track down an abducted child. There is nothing but circumstance here, but the prospect of a deal being made between Abigail and the Pinkertons is certainly an interesting one. And interestingly, during this cutscene, she's nowhere to be seen. Next, in the Saint Denis chapter, during the bank robbery, Abigail and Hosea split off from the rest of the gang to set a distraction. This distraction works, however the Pinkertons already know about the bank robbery and set a trap of their own. Hosea is caught, but Abigail conveniently manages to slip away. And what do they do with Hosea? Well, Agent Milton kills him in cold blood.
No! God damn it!
There's your deal, Dutch.
Hosea.
On the roof, Lenny is also gunned down. However, John gets grabbed and arrested. However, Milton has shown, with Matt Callender and Hosea, that he has no problem simply killing members of the gang on the spot. So what makes John special when already in hot pursuit of the leadership? Dutch even addresses, despite his mental decline, that something doesn't quite add up during the Guarma chapter.
So what happened with John in that bank?
He survived. Unlike dear Hosea and Lenny. The only one they took alive. Why is that, you think?
I don't know. I was already on the roof. I didn't see it.
And Abigail, I presume she was able to slip away in time.
What are you talking about?
You know, when I look back at all the chaos of the past few weeks, the apparent superficial chaos, I begin to wonder, maybe, for somebody, this is all going exactly to plan.
Still ain't sure what you're saying, Dutch.
Nor am I, quite, but that many Pinkertons arriving like clockwork once again? That must have taken days to organize. Maybe there's a maggot in the apple.
What if Dutch isn't wrong? Obviously, Dutch believes John to be the rat, but what if Abigail was indeed up to no good, or at least she wasn't acting in the interest of the gang, but rather her son? And if she believed taking down the Van der Linde gang was the best way to protect her, Jack, and John, then of course she was going to do that. Perhaps after Arthur, Dutch, Bill and Micah returned from Guarma, Abigail had realised the error she'd made in trusting Milton, as he has no intention on living up to his end of the deal, and there's talk of hanging John. In fact, she can't stop mentioning that John is in need of rescue. As for their current hideout in Le Quay, it's very quickly discovered, probably thanks to Bill literally asking everyone he met where the Van der Linde gang were hiding, which would have drawn some attention. And Milton is there, quite happy to light up the gang with a Maxim gun immediately. It's very clear that Agent Milton doesn't care who he kills. In many ways, he's equally as reprehensible as the notorious outlaws he's chasing. So it doesn't matter if he has an inside source or not, and he doesn't care if they die, provided he gets his man. So any prospective deals between Abigail and the Pinkertons is now void. So maybe John is now in captivity thanks to Abigail's actions, and with the security between Abigail and the Pinkertons severed, he's now at the mercy of the law, and Dutch believes him to be the traitor, so he has no intention of rescuing him.
I just need somebody to buy me some goddamn time, one of you.
You'll figure it out, boss. You always do.
What are you gonna do about John, Dutch?
John?
He's in jail.
We'll get him. Abigail, just not yet.
There's talk of hanging him.
It's not gonna come to that.
Dutch!
Not now, Mesa. Not now.
I'm begging you to. They're gonna hang him. Break the boy's heart. Please, do something. We will.
Things certainly take a turn going into Chapter 6, with Molly confessing to being the rat, though by this point in the video, we know for certain that she wasn't. She was sweated by the Pinkertons, but she never said a thing. Abigail is visibly shocked at this supposed revelation, though I'm not going to put too much stock in this meaning one thing or another. It could be guilt, or it could just be the tension of this scene being palpable, and the outcome being inevitable. And then in the final mission for Chapter 6, Abigail is taken by the Pinkertons, and I'm not entirely sure why.
They came and took Abigail. I saved Jack. We hid, but they took Abigail.
Who did?
Agent Milton and his men took her to Van Horn to be put on a boat and tried for murder.
I am sorry to hear that.
We gotta let her go.
So the Pinkertons ran into camp and took whoever they could as prisoner to try for murder, and that just so happened to be Abigail. Sadie and Arthur ride to Van Horn to enact a rescue mission, which leads to the final confrontation with Agent Milton. After a brief conversation and a tussle, Abigail kills him.
Horrible man.
It feels like there's more to this moment than just the past 10 minutes of story. Maybe by this point Abigail had realised her mistake in possibly confiding in the Pinkertons to aid her, her son and John. And this moment was her redemption for actions that occurred off screen. Sure, Milton just said that Micah was the rat and Molly said nothing, but his actions throughout the main story show him to not be a man of honour. He could have easily lied if it meant that there was a chance it sowed further destruction amongst the Van der Linde gang. At the same time, even if he's telling the truth, who's to say it's the whole truth? On the grounds of looking out for a family first, Abigail is a pretty good suspect in all reality. Whether or not she actually was secretly a rat is a different question altogether. But if you feel like believing that, I can see why. It's a well-argued point. It makes sense, and hopefully I've done it justice there. But I can tell you with certainty that there is another traitor within the Van der Linde gang, but it isn't quite who or how you'd expect. What if I told you this other traitor wasn't an informant for the Pinkertons, and was in fact the last individual you would expect to betray the gang? But regardless, they compromised the gang time and time again, right in front of our very eyes. I am of course talking about Dutch van der Linde himself. He's the leader of the gang and he formed it in his image. He imposed his belief on his followers. He imposed his way of life, his way of thinking on those that surround him, including Arthur Morgan, John Marston, Bill Williamson, and every other member of the gang. They all follow this code established by Dutch, but Dutch himself no longer does. This change in character is pointed out incredibly often. On top of the code he seems to have established and then strayed from himself, his tactics draw an awful lot of attention. Basically simplified to make a lot of noise and then disappear. It's a flawed logic because it's hard to vanish when you are loud. Dutch also makes a habit of selecting high-profile targets to rob, and his own ego cannot handle taking criticism. This is why throughout the course of Red Dead Redemption 2 there is no bigger threat to the Van der Linde gang than Dutch van der Linde himself. Dutch's hubris, his arrogance and his delusion create the very problems that he will later claim are the result of a traitor in the gang. And perhaps there could be, but no matter which way you look at it, it's Dutch's decisions that cause the vast majority of the problems the gang faces in their final few months. Arthur puts this best himself.
We don't need a rat. We got sloppier than the town drunk.
So what if the gang's biggest rat is refusal to accept reality? And by that I mean Dutch's refusal. There are many angles you could tackle this topic from. All of them are interesting in their own right. The Abigail theory is certainly intriguing, so big props to Fizhy Gaming for that one, or at least pointing me in the direction of that one. I will of course be leaving a link to his video on the topic in the description. As for my thoughts, I believe Abigail being a rat is certainly possible, but above all else, Dutch van der Linde has proven to be his own worst enemy. As for Micah, it doesn't matter. At no point was he truly loyal to the gang. He was only ever loyal to himself. Whatever extended his chances of survival was what he did. But what are your thoughts? As all of that brings us nicely to the end of today's video. Thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated, of course. Be sure to check out Fizhy Gaming's channel via the link in the description. And whilst you're down there rummaging through all of the links, I have no clue how many are down there this time, maybe check out my history channel, Decades. We recently published a video on the history of pubs, and in my opinion it's worth a watch. So if history is something that intrigues you, then maybe go give it a look, but whether or not you do that is completely your decision. But anyway, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon for another video at some point, but until next time, please take care, and goodbye.